Here's a ridiculous question with a straightforward, easily discoverable answer that has nonetheless been the subject of heated debate within the Star Trek fan community of late. Is Star Trek Discovery even actually canon? And the answer? Yes, it is. Too succinct? Okay then. Yes, Discovery is canon because the producers of the show and CBS, which owns the intellectual property of Star Trek, say it is, and that is literally as complex as this question gets because the concept of canon is meaningless apart from an entity that has the authority to define what constitutes a given canon. And for Star Trek, that entity is CBS, and CBS says all live-action Star Trek TV series and films are canon. Therefore, Discovery is canon. Thank you. Good night. Don't forget to tip your server. Except, why is this even a question people are asking in the first place? For the benefit of those of you who were fortunate enough to know nothing about this subject until you watched this video, a brief summary. There is a segment of the Star Trek fanbase that has insisted since the series debuted that Star Trek Discovery is not actually canonical. Actually, let me stop there. Just so there's no misunderstanding, when I and most other people talk in terms of canon in reference to an entertainment franchise, we're talking about the collection of works related to that franchise that have been deemed authentic. If we say a given story is part of Star Trek canon, that means the events portrayed in that story are considered to have actually happened within the fictional universe of Star Trek. For decades, the rule has been that Star Trek canon includes every live-action TV series and film, but not much beyond that. There are gray areas, like Star Trek the Animated Series, some of which has been treated as canonical, most of which has been ignored, but generally speaking, if it happens in a live-action episode or movie, it really happened, and if it happened in a story presented in any other medium, like a novel or a comic book, it's apocryphal. However, canonicity isn't really the issue here. As I've already said, there's no question that Discovery is canon. CBS says it is, and that's that. Those who argue that Discovery is not canon are using the term canon in an imprecise and misleading way. When they refer to canon, they're referring to the Star Trek shows and movies produced prior to the 2009 Star Trek film. Basically everything from the start of the original series up to the end of Enterprise, what we might call the original timeline of Star Trek. All of which is canon, but the 2009 film series is also canon, as is Discovery. It's all officially part of Star Trek. It all actually happened within the fictional universe, or should I say multiverse, of the franchise. What those who say Discovery isn't canon are actually saying is that Discovery is not set in the same timeline as those pre-2009 productions. Recently, this insistence has crystallized into a conspiracy theory centered on licensing and rights issues related to CBS and Paramount. The theory goes something like this. The producers of Discovery have said over and over that their show takes place in the prime timeline of the Star Trek universe. While most of us assume that by prime timeline, they're referring to the timeline where the previous Star Trek TV shows and the first 10 movies take place, the original timeline, this theory proposes that the prime timeline is actually a new timeline that was introduced in 2009's Star Trek film, which also introduced what is now officially called the Kelvin timeline. According to this theory, the older version of Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy in the Kelvin timeline films, is not the same Spock played by Nimoy in Star Trek the original series and the first 6 Star Trek films and the reunification 2-part episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. Instead, this is a different Spock, and his native timeline, the one he travels back from into the past along with Nero to create the Kelvin timeline, is not the same timeline in which classic Trek, TNG, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the first 10 Star Trek movies take place. So when the producers of Star Trek Discovery say their show takes place in the prime timeline, while they know most fans assume they mean the original timeline of classic Trek, TNG et al., they actually mean this newer, different timeline that was introduced in the 2009 Star Trek film. What's the evidence for this? Nothing! There's no evidence! There's nothing to this! That's what makes it a conspiracy theory. It's pure, baseless conjecture. And willfully ignorant of evidence to the contrary to boot. Surely if there was ever any doubt that the character known as Spock Prime, who we see in the Kelvin Timeline films, is meant to be the same Spock Leonard Nimoy had played since the original series, that doubt was put to rest by this lovely moment in Star Trek Beyond, when Kelvin Spock is sorting through the personal effects of the recently deceased Spock Prime and finds this cast photo from Star Trek V. If you can watch this scene and not understand that Spock Prime is the original Spock and his native timeline is the original Star Trek timeline, you're working way too hard to miss the point. So far as I can tell, there are two factors animating and sustaining this Prime timeline is not the original timeline conspiracy theory. The first is easily spotted. It's the dissatisfaction some Star Trek fans feel toward Discovery. Though I want to be clear, it's not all fans who dislike Discovery who are driving this particular conspiracy theory. It's a subset of fans who don't like Discovery. Those who feel so entitled to the show they wanted, whatever that means to them, and feel so deeply betrayed by Discovery because it's not that show, that they seek to delegitimize it and discredit its producers as cynical hacks trying to deceive and exploit them. That's the first driving factor. Let's call that the aggrieved fan syndrome. The second factor is the status of Star Trek's corporate ownership, which has been widely misunderstood, but luckily is not that difficult to understand if you make just a bit of an effort. The intellectual property that comprises what we think of as Star Trek was owned by Viacom until the end of 2005, when Viacom was split into two companies, CBS Corporation and a new version of Viacom. The Star Trek brand is owned by CBS Television Studios, which is a subsidiary of CBS Corporation. But, and here's where it can get confusing if you're not paying attention, the Star Trek film library, that's every Star Trek movie from Star Trek the Motion Picture to Star Trek Beyond, is owned by Paramount Pictures, which is a subsidiary of the new Viacom. Paramount Pictures also retains the exclusive right to produce new Star Trek movies and the home video distribution rights to the TV series. This arrangement is often cited as the reason why, when the film series was resumed in 2009, the new films featured a younger version of the classic Trek crew and were set in an alternate timeline, but I've never seen any actual evidence of that. When Paramount began developing a new Star Trek film after the CBS-Viacom split, it could have developed another movie in the pre-existing timeline if it had wanted to. There was nothing legally to stop it or to require it to obtain a special license from CBS in order to do it. So far as I can tell, the decision to center the new films on the adventures of a younger Captain Kirk in what eventually became known as the Kelvin timeline was a creative one, not a legally mandated one. The arrangement between CBS and Paramount over Star Trek isn't always so cut and dry. The merchandising agreements for the Kelvin Timeline films are apparently quite complicated, which in turn fuels speculation and conjecture by conspiracy theorists who insist that the Kelvin Timeline and the separate Prime Timeline, in which they say Discovery actually takes place, are part of a secret alternate license granted by CBS, which allows Paramount to take a bigger cut of merchandise related to its Star Trek films. Why such a merchandising agreement between CBS and Paramount would require the creation of a distinctive new timeline for the movies has never been explained to my knowledge. Nor has it ever been explained why CBS, which owns the Star Trek brand and has the right to make new Star Trek TV series, would need or even want to set its new show in an offshoot of the Kelvin timeline rather than setting it in the original timeline, much less why it would publicly declare that it was doing the latter while secretly doing the former. And yet that's precisely what these fan conspiracy theorists are saying CBS has done. Set Discovery not in the original Star Trek timeline, but in the newly created Prime timeline, which is different than the original timeline. This, so say the proponents of this conspiracy theory, explains why Discovery, like the Kelvin Timeline films, is so visually different from other Star Trek series. Because I forgot to mention this, didn't I? Get a load of this. This is the best. According to the terms of the alternate license under which the Kelvin timeline and also this supposed newly established Prime timeline were created, a license no one who talks about it has ever seen any real evidence of, so far as I can tell, the production must be at least 25% different from the original Star Trek timeline. What does that mean? How is that 25% difference quantified? I have no idea. Again, no one who talks about it as though it's a fact seems to have any idea how it works. But I have a better question. Where did this 25% figure even come from? We know exactly where it came from. And that's why we also know that it's bullshit. Last year on Facebook, John Eaves, an artist and designer who's worked on Star Trek production since the 1980s, discussed his work on the first season of Discovery, including creating the concept art for the USS Enterprise's appearance at the conclusion of the season finale. Eaves said that he'd been given a guideline that the Discovery version of the Enterprise had to be 25% different than the original design. His fellow designer Scott Schneider commented that this 25% difference was a legal requirement. Eaves explained further that this was the result of the split between the TV side of Star Trek at CBS and the movie side of Star Trek at Paramount. These Facebook comments by Eaves and Schneider are the only source for the various claims that a Discovery has to be 25% different rule exists. But that's not even what Eaves said. He said that he was told to make his concept art for the Discovery version of the Enterprise 25% different than the original design. That's it. He said nothing about there being a rule that the Discovery series itself had to be 25% different, or that any Star Trek intellectual property featured in the series had to be 25% different, or anything other than a design guideline he was given when tasked with creating the concept art. So there's that. There's also the fact that within a matter of days after various websites reported on Eaves's 25% difference comments, CBS clarified that the changes to the design of the Enterprise seen on Discovery were a creative choice, not a legal requirement, because CBS owns Star Trek and the producers of Discovery could have used the original design if they'd wanted to. Eaves himself acknowledged that he might not be the best source for information on how Star Trek's corporate ownership affects Discovery. When a commenter on that Facebook post pointed out that CBS owns Star Trek and should be able to use whatever Enterprise design it wants, Eaves replied that the commenter was asking the wrong guy. Since there has never been any evidence presented for the existence of the 25% rule, and the one comment from a concept artist from which others extrapolated that the rule must exist has been disputed by CBS, let's behave like reasonable people instead of like conspiracy theorists and assume no such rule exists. Okay? No evidence for a secret alternate license, no evidence for a 25% rule. CBS and the producers of Discovery have stated unambiguously that their show is a prequel to Star Trek the original series, and the events it depicts take place in the same timeline, and the differences in design and aesthetic between Discovery and classic Trek are the result of creative decisions, not legal requirements. And by the way, I'm pretty sure I've got this right, but if I've missed some crucial bit of evidence, or if someone watching this is an intellectual property rights attorney, or someone with first-hand knowledge of the situation at CBS and Paramount concerning Star Trek, that is, someone who actually knows more about this than I do, not a disillusioned fan who hates Discovery and has what he thinks is a really compelling theory about how it technically doesn't exist or whatever, please feel free to comment to add to what I've said here and correct me where I'm wrong. So that's that then? We're done? Almost. But not quite. There's one last leg of this conspiracy theory to be sawn off. Sure, CBS and the producers of Discovery say their show takes place in the original timeline, but what if they're lying? Discovery can't possibly take place in the same timeline as the original series Next Generation and the other Trek TV series because it doesn't fit there. It's too different. Therefore, when producers talk about the prime timeline, they're not referring to the original timeline, but actually to this similar but legally distinct timeline created for the 2009 movie, which falls under the secret alternate license and has to be 25% different than the original blah 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 praxis was an inside job. Is there any merit to the position that Discovery can't actually be set in the original timeline because it's too different from the other shows? No, there is not, for one very simple reason. Star Trek is imaginary. Not exactly a stunning insight, I know, and yet the Discovery isn't canon conspiracy theorists seem to have overlooked this fairly obvious point. The most frustrating thing about this argument for me is Star Trek is far from the first franchise to radically alter its production design without an in-story explanation. Want to see my favorite example of this? Here's Gotham City in Tim Burton's 1989 Batman film. Here's Gotham City about 8 years later in Batman and Robin, Joel Schumacher's second Batman film. Two significantly different styles of production design. Two fictional locations which, if you didn't know any better, you'd probably assume were supposed to be two totally different places, except they're both supposed to be the exact same place. Batman and Batman and Robin take place in the same timeline. No reboot and no in-story explanations for the extensive changes in style and design from one movie to the next. It's just different because the filmmakers decided to make it different. And everybody accepted it. Not everybody liked it. The production design was one of the most celebrated aspects of Tim Burton's Batman. Joel Schumacher's not so much, but I don't remember anyone, no matter how much they thought Batman and Robin sucked, seriously trying to argue that it must have been set in a different timeline than Tim Burton's Batman, and it was a lie if Warner Brothers said otherwise. You can make all the videos you want pointing out the visual similarities between Discovery and the Kelvin timeline films, underlining the inconsistencies in the designs and the levels of technology presented in Discovery and Classic Trek, and none of it matters because we're talking about fiction, not history. If I were to show you what I claimed was an authentic photograph of Abraham Lincoln talking on an iPhone in 1864, the anachronism of the iPhone would be all the evidence you need to prove that my claim of the photograph's authenticity isn't true. That can't be a real photograph of Abraham Lincoln talking on an iPhone because Abraham Lincoln couldn't possibly have had an iPhone because Lincoln died in 1865 and iPhones weren't introduced until 2007. Sure, I could defend the photograph's authenticity by insisting that iPhones have secretly existed since the early 19th century, or that Lincoln's iPhone was given to him by a time traveler from the 21st century, but those are both such extraordinary claims that unless I have some very solid evidence to back them up, no reasonable person should believe them. It's far more likely that the photograph is a fake and that I am either honestly mistaken or willfully lying about its authenticity. But that same method doesn't work when applied to a fictional universe like Star Trek. Fans who cite Discovery's look and level of tech as evidence that it can't be set in the original timeline are doing the same thing I described in my Lincoln's iPhone hypothetical. They're comparing what they see in Discovery to what they're treating as established history. They're saying, look at these photographs of the USS Enterprise from the year 2254. Look at the design of the exterior and interior of the ship. Look at the uniforms worn by the crew. Look at the technology. Now, look at these photographs, supposedly of the same ship in the year 2257, a mere 3 years later. Look at the noticeable discrepancies in the interior and exterior design. Look at the technology, which is obviously much different and far more advanced. It simply isn't possible that this Enterprise and this Enterprise are the exact same ship. Furthermore, compare these images of the USS Discovery to these of the USS Enterprise as depicted in the Kelvin timeline movies. Notice the similarities in starship design and technology level. Notice the similarities in uniform design, right down to the tiny Starfleet arrowhead insignia incorporated into the tunics. Notice the similarities in the design of Klingons as well. Considering these similarities alongside the aforementioned discrepancies between Discovery and the previously established canon of the original Star Trek timeline, we can only conclude that Discovery does not actually take place in that original timeline, and is in fact set in an alternate timeline, the design of which is closely related to the timeline of the Kelvin films. On the surface, that sounds like a fairly solid argument. It sounds even better when I'm saying it because I'm not a delusional dipshit who expects you to actually believe it. But it's not a solid argument at all. Nothing I just said matters. It doesn't matter how different Discovery looks from other Star Trek shows set during roughly the same time frame. It doesn't matter how much more advanced the technology is than what we see in The Cage or the classic Trek episodes that are set nearly 10 years later. It doesn't matter that in some ways Discovery looks a lot more like the Kelvin timeline movies than it does classic Trek. All that matters is that the producers of Discovery and CBS, which owns the intellectual property, say their show takes place in the same timeline as classic Trek. Prime timeline is the original timeline, and Discovery takes place in that timeline because the authors of the show and the holders of the rights to the franchise say so. Discovery looks so different despite being set in the same universe in roughly the same time period as classic Trek because the people who make Discovery want it to look that way. Alex Kurtzman, the co-creator and executive producer of Discovery, made this clear in October 2017.
Obviously, we look more modern than the original series because we are in a modern world now, and if we made the show look that way, people would not feel that it was worth the money. So I think you'll see a lot of tips of the hat to devices from the original series and the timeline. But yes, obviously, we wanted to create a more modern experience, and that necessitated certain adjustments.
Now here's the thing, you don't have to like it. You don't have to like the way the show looks. If the fact that Discovery looks so different from classic Trek, despite being a prequel, is an insurmountable obstacle to your enjoyment of it, that's a valid reaction. It's not how I feel, but you're allowed to feel that way. You don't have to agree with the creative decisions Alex Kurtzman and his fellow creators of Star Trek Discovery made, but they had the right to make those decisions, whether you think they chose wisely or not. Regardless of your opinion, regardless of how well it fits with previously established parts of Star Trek canon, if the producers of Discovery say their show takes place in the original timeline and is set about 10 years before the events of the original series, then that's it. There's no point in spinning out elaborate conspiracy theories in an attempt to show that Discovery isn't part of the original timeline, because if that's what its creators say it is, that's what it is. They're able to decide what is true within their fictional world because they're the ones who are making it up. They're free to make creative choices about their own show, and they're only bound by the choices made by those who produced earlier shows insofar as they choose to be. So if you don't like Discovery, if you think its producers made bad choices, if you don't think it fits with the rest of the franchise, if it just doesn't feel like Star Trek to you, whatever reason you have for not digging it, that's okay. Don't watch it. Or watch it and hate it if that's how you want to spend your time. But don't buy into these conspiracy theories about alternate licenses and the prime timeline secretly being distinct from the original timeline and Discovery having to be 25% different than the original series, because that's rooted in nothing but disgruntled fanboy horseshit. And if you'll swallow an obviously baseless, made-up conspiracy theory about Star Trek of all things, you may be liable to believe in more seriously harmful ideas, like the idea that people never landed on the moon, or that the Holocaust didn't happen, or that immigrants and refugees are an urgent existential threat to your society. And that would be a shame, because I don't know much, which is probably why I spend so much time talking about Star Trek, but I do know the world would be a damn sight better off if it had fewer credulous shitheads running around in it. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed that one. Before I go any further, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons, and their names are Attila Pires dos Santos, thank you Attila, Ellie Flanagan, thank you Ellie, Sean Helsum, thank you Sean, and Michael Bryan, thank you Michael. Those are my newest patrons to pledge $5 or more per month to support this channel and the work that I do here on Patreon. If you want to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives and become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month, but $5 a month or more gets you a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video, just like those folks whose names I just read. Now, little programming update. As regular viewers know, the originally announced next proper Trek Actually video was to be on the subject of who is actually Star Trek's most reckless time traveler. That video is still scheduled. It is still going to come out in a couple of weeks as originally intended. I slotted this video in a little bit early because this subject is something that I've seen a lot of people talking about online and YouTube videos on Twitter and forums and stuff, and it turns out I had a lot to say about it, so I wanted to get this video finished and out before that, so that's why the order is a little mixed up. So the time travel video is still coming up next. It will still be the next the next proper scripted Trek Actually video after this one. This one just kind of jumped the gun a little, so I apologize if there was any confusion. If you want to vote for an upcoming Trek Actually topic, you can still go to patreon.com/Steve Shives, and patrons at all levels, no matter how much you're contributing, can take part in the poll to decide, in this case, the subject for the April Trek Actually video, because March's will be the aforementioned time travel video. April's Trek Actually topic will be determined by the results of the poll that is currently ongoing. Also, if you enjoy these Star Trek videos I do, I want to remind you, as I always do, that in addition to making these Trek Actually videos, I am also the co-host of a Star Trek themed comedy podcast called The Ensign's Log, where I, along with the brilliant Jason Harding, play low-ranking officers on a certain famous Federation starship that is embarking on a certain legendary 5-year mission. I think you know what I'm getting at here. You can listen to the Ensign's Log. It is linked in the description box of this video. Look for the Time Traveler video coming up in a few weeks. And that's it. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.